Stephen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great to see you, and thanks for inviting me on. We can map out a plan that fits in with and integrates with their overall business strategy. And that's the only way, you can really capture the value in the business and use IP to its fullest to help in that growth story.
Welcome to Future Speak. I'm your host, Sam Eaton. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Stephen Carter. Stephen is the founder of the Intellectual Property Works. He's an IP lawyer with a difference. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us today. I'd like to introduce everyone to Stephen Carter, who's the founder of the Intellectual Property Works. Stephen, please do introduce yourself and explain a little bit about the mission that you're on right now.
Hi, Sam. Great to see you, and thanks for inviting me on. So I guess I could sum it up by saying I'm on a mission to help small and medium-sized businesses understand the importance of intellectual property to their business and how it can really be the foundations of their success. So I founded the Intellectual Property Works about 3.5 years ago now, building on my 20 plus years experience in the patent attorney industry. And I've worked with a range of clients during that time, but worked with a lot of small clients and recognised, a lot of the same issues they were facing in terms of not having access to really good quality advice early enough in their journey. Because a lot of the time, what we were finding with those smaller businesses is that we were helping them with their IP when they'd encountered a problem. So it was sorting out the problem from them and then setting them off on the right track. Whereas I guess, my strong belief is that if you can get in and help these companies at a much earlier stage, you can help them avoid those problems in the first instance.
One of the things that I always do when I'm explaining what you do is that you commercialise IP. I think very few IP lawyers really get that and get the importance of it. They do it for a living, which is ironic when I say that statement, but that's really important, isn't it?
It is. And I think, some of it is they don't get the opportunity to do it because they're not having the right conversations with those clients. But you're right. There's too many small businesses that see IP as something in isolation, and they're focused on, or the conversations they're having with their advisors is about, what IP can I get, and how good is the IP going to be, and how strong is the IP going to be, and what's it going to cost me? And that's often where the conversation ends. But that kind of detachment of the IP from actually the business as a whole just means you end up with bad decisions being taken. And so what I try and talk to clients about and get them to understand is how IP works for their business. It's a business tool, and like any business tool, it only works for you if you use it in the context of your overall business strategy, your overall business plan. So if you can talk to these businesses at an early stage and you can understand what their plan is, what's their strategy for growth, what is it they're looking to achieve with their business? I guess ultimately at the end of the day, how are they going to make money and provide a return for the investors in their business? Then you can start to map out an IP strategy. And we're not just talking patents here. There's various forms of IP, intellectual property protection and intellectual property assets that you have to consider. But we can map out a plan that fits in with and integrates with their overall business strategy. And that's the only way that you can really capture the value in the business and use IP to its fullest to help in that growth story.
It's interesting. So I was trying to talk to a business owner recently about the importance of IP, and I can't put it as eloquently as you did just then. But one of the things, going back to your point on IP assets, there's some simple things, aren't there, that a business owner who's got aspirations for growth and eventually selling can put in place. What things would you recommend that they look at doing before they come to you?
I think, maybe taking a little step backwards, I think it's important to understand. So when people think about intellectual property, particularly technology-based businesses are the ones I tend to be working with. So whether that's software or it might be medical device development. When they think about intellectual property, the first thing that they think about is patents, and what they're actually thinking about there is intellectual property protection, and that's actually a lot of the conversations they're having with IP advisors focuses very much on that protection side of things. And as you know from some of the discussions we've had in the past, that's the wrong place to start. And I think the starting point is that to these small businesses to recognise that if they're innovating, then they're creating what I would call intellectual property assets. So that intellectual property that they're generating, it's the stuff that comes from their mind or comes from the mind of the innovators they're working with. And so it could be things like, it could be the designs of products, it could be the software code that's being written, it could be the branding strategy that goes around it. It could be things as simple as the data that they've gathered that's going to support the development process they're about to go through. So all of these assets have value to the business, but it's impossible to capture that value and then make decisions about how and whether to protect it if you don't keep a good record. So one of the really simple things that small businesses can do without really spending any money is just make sure that they have a really good record of the IP assets that are being created. So the things that their business value is going to be built on going forwards. And you'd be surprised, very, very few businesses take that step. It's the information about those assets is probably there somewhere in their, in their document database or in their email database, but having what I would refer to as an IP asset register. So something that lists what these assets are and what their relevance is to the business can be super valuable. And it's something that once you've got and you maintain it on a regular basis, it also puts you in a position where you can start to have discussions with potential investors, for example, with a good understanding yourself of what your IP asset base is. And with that list, it also allows you to then go on and look at questions around whether and how you're going to protect it and what types of intellectual property protection might be suitable. So is it going to be something that you can keep secret and protect with trade secrets, or is it something that's sufficiently valuable and the right strategic decision is to file patent applications to protect it?
Yeah.
And then I think the other big issue that I see often with smaller businesses, and the nature of smaller businesses, and actually one of the trends I think we're seeing generally in the small business world or other, there's a growth of small businesses, and small businesses by their nature like collaboration, and they tend to work with partners. So when as a small business you're innovating, you're often bringing in people who aren't employees to help you. And one of the consequence of that is that one of the issues I see quite often are issues around ownership of this intellectual property. And it's one of those things that people don't think about early enough in the process. And often down the line, it can be really difficult to sort out IP ownership issues. I kind of talk about it sometimes as being a ticking time bomb, because you don't realize it's an issue when it's going on at the time. But when you get into, let's say, due diligence in the context of a fundraise, that's when people are going to poke about and uncover these issues with ownership. And it's things as simple as, if you're going out to a software house to write the code for the app you're developing that's going to change the world in some amazing way, and you're planning to grow a really big business on the basis of this app, if you don't have the right contract in place with that software house, you could find yourself in a position where, as the business that thinks it's their app, they don't actually own the copyright in the software that's being created. So that's another area that I think small businesses can really focus on, and just by having the right mindset when they're engaging with contractors or other suppliers, if they in the back of their minds have this understanding that IP is important and IP is going to be generated as part of this relationship, and just make sure they have that discussion about where the ownership of that IP is going to lie and who's going to be able to do what with it, and build that into the agreements that are set up at the time.
So for business owners, you've talked about the tech space there a moment ago, and I know you do a lot in the sports tech and med tech sector as well. When's the optimum time for them to approach you and start to have that conversation to protect the assets in their business?
I guess the slightly simplistic answer, and maybe the one you'd expect, is as soon as possible. But I sort of genuinely mean that. I mean, I'm always open to having conversations with people. I'd almost rather people spoke to me much earlier in their journey. Even the barrier to that often is people think, oh, well, I can't afford to speak to a patent attorney because the clock's going to be ticking and they're going to start incurring charges which I can't afford. And that's, I mean, certainly the way I work, and the way other people. That there are other people out there that work in the same way as me. I'm always happy to have an initial conversation and to give some pointers. And hopefully also from those conversations, they understand, actually the true value of getting things right from the outset, and how they ought to then be investing in their IP strategy from a very early stage in the same way that they're investing in their business strategy. And in fact, I would argue that a business strategy isn't really a strategy or a business strategy at all, unless for these sorts of businesses it takes into account the IP side of things, and because that is, by the nature of their business, that's where the value is going to be. And if your business strategy doesn't deal with capturing and protecting that value, then you're setting yourself up for failure, in my view.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I know, again, we've had conversations about the importance, particularly those who are going through a round of funding and a series of funding, the importance of having that IP in place. How much of a no-no, in your experience, is delaying getting that IP to a potential investor?
It's an interesting question. It's one of those ones where I think the answer does vary a bit from investor to investor. Different investors have different levels of sophistication when it comes to looking at the business's IP. And I've certainly, I had an interesting conversation with an investor recently where they actually took the view that for very early stage companies, they didn't really expect them to have patents as such. Because they appreciate that that's something that that might be one of the reasons they're looking for the funding, but they still very clearly wanted them to have an understanding of the role that IP played and to have a good, I guess you'd call it a good IP story, so that if even though they may not have patents, if they have an outline strategy and a strategy maybe that says for now we're using trade secrets because we're keeping our development under wraps. And once we've got this round of funding, we're going to start spending money on filing patent applications. That would be, in a lot of cases, a very acceptable IP story for an early stage investor. The other interesting comment that someone made recently was that whilst, particularly in the early stage investments, I think we all know investors are typically looking at the team and they're looking at the market opportunity are probably the main things they're looking at. But the interesting comment I heard the other day was that this particular investor said that they like to see, or rather, if they see a good IP strategy as part of the management documentation, then they treat that as a good barometer to show that the management are thinking in the right way. And if they're thinking in the right way about IP, then it probably means they're thinking in the right way about a lot of other things as well, because IP is one of those topics that often gets overlooked. So if they're dealing with that, they're probably dealing with all of the other stuff in a sensible, pragmatic way.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. It goes back to that strategic thinking and thinking forward. And with that in mind, we've got so much happening in the world of technology right now. And I'm guessing you're probably seeing a lot of things that a lot of us simply haven't even thought of right now. How do you see the world of IP and what you do change and morph over the next couple of years, say, with everything that's happening in the technology space right now?
I guess, how do I see it changing? I think, what I actually think is we're going to see more, we're going to see more interest in IP. So I think, I've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, in the UK and elsewhere, and I think sadly probably the UK lags up behind a bit some other countries in this sense. But we've seen more awareness of IP and the sort of importance of IP, but still maybe a lack of understanding of what it really is and how you manage it properly. I think, and I hope and I think that as we move forward through the next decade, that understanding of the importance of IP is going to grow more, and it's going to become more kind of inherent in the thinking of business leaders. We have seen it over the last 5 to 10 years move from a kind of backroom topic to a board level topic. So a lot of boards will be discussing, or at least having reports reported to them about IP on a regular basis. So I think in terms of how the world sees IP, I think we're going to, we've seen it grow in importance, and I think we're going to see it growing in even more in importance, which I guess is not surprising when you think of the way the technology space is going and how tech and people talk about the fourth industrial revolution, don't they? Which is data-driven economy, data being the new oil, and what that means is that tech and data are flowing through everything. You don't really have a discrete tech industry now. Tech has just kind of spread its tentacles out across all of the verticals, and that I think is bringing with it a greater need to understand IP. And there's people out there that are trying to spread the word and educate, and I think we are going to see more engagement with IP. We're going to see, actually one of the stats I was looking at earlier today, actually, it kind of popped up on a LinkedIn, someone's LinkedIn post, but looking at how sophisticated in many ways China have got in relation to IP, and Chinese companies filing strategies becoming more sophisticated and being based on sort of real, genuine innovation in China, driven by government policies, where they've set themselves to target by, I think it's by 2025, to be an economy and a country that is known for innovating, rather than perhaps what historically we thought of China as being is someone who mimics rather than innovates.
It feels like a brave new world right now. And personally, I think it's a really exciting world. Change always brings chaos, but chaos always brings opportunity. And certainly the world of IP is a real must-have for so many of these businesses. How important do you rate communication in terms of IP and that whole education piece with founders today?
I think it's key. I mean, I've, as you know, I've sort of talked a bit in the past to audiences about various IP topics. But I think a common theme through all of those conversations and talks has been education. And I think it's, one of the points I like to make is that it's not enough to have one person in an organization that appreciates and understands the importance of IP, because IP is so kind of inherent to everything that happens in a business. You really need a lot of people in the business to have a good understanding of IP and the role that IP plays in that particular business. So they, and it's simple things like understanding that if they're working in the R&D department and they're working on new developments, that it's not okay to talk to your mates about that down the pub, because that's a disclosure that could either kind of ruin the strategy if the strategy is one of trade secrets to keep the developments confidential, and it could also cause serious issues for patent applications that haven't been filed yet. So it's simple educational things like that, but also them just understanding the role, how IP can also help them in their job. So, one of the things that people often forget is that, yes, you're innovating, you're developing IP, but you're not the only ones in the world doing that, and actually your competitors are doing the same thing. And one of the other things that I encourage smaller businesses, in any business to do, is to look at the competitor IP. Don't be blinkered. Let's go out and see what the competition are up to. And partly that can give you some really good insights into the direction that a competitor is taking their technology, because patent applications typically precede the commercialization of the technology. So if you watch the way a competitor's patent portfolio is developing and growing, it can give you often a really good indication of the direction that they're taking their technology development, and therefore their future commercialization of their technology.
That's a valid point, and certainly something that I hope lots of founders will take note of. Now, Stephen, I have a very important question for you. If you were stuck on an island and you could only take one thing, what would you take?
Gosh, what would I take? I think I would take a rugby ball. And you can ask why now. And I think partly it's something to entertain myself with, throwing a rugby ball around, bouncing it off things. And also, because it's obviously inflated with air, it floats, and I could use it to swim off the island like a float.
Stephen, that is possibly the most ingenious answer I've had so far. So thank you for that. And I love the thought that went into that. If we look forward to the next couple of years, and on a final point, what's the best piece of advice you can share with someone who's looking to accelerate their growth in the next couple of years?
I think it's quite simple. I think it's just to kind of appreciate and embrace that your success is going to be dependent on how well you identify and manage and look after and nurture the intellectual property that you're creating within your business, and to think about it right from the outset when you're planning your new business.